Tonight I am going to be continuing the class on the Mountain Dharma as taught by Karma Chagme, as taught by Khenpo Karta Rinpoche. The chapter today is titled Disc of the Sun, the Way of Protecting the Three Vows. And this is a very interesting section here. This section on taking these three vows, it also includes the benefits one receives from taking them, and then all the consequences that can result from our failure to behave properly. And I am not going to cover that last part tonight. So here are the various choices that we have as Buddhists, that we can be a lay person, or we can be ordained as a monk or a nun. And because of these possibilities, we can experience many different kinds of situations, good circumstances, bad circumstances in life. On the other hand, to end in a very positive note, if you have not attained enlightenment at the end of this kalpa of 1,000 Buddhas, you will become a Buddha, or at least a disciple of the Buddha. That is what Karma Chagme says. He stresses in this chapter, no matter what you do after you take these vows, that there is a commitment and a continuity in your mind stream, one life after another, that eventually leads everyone to becoming a Buddha. So this is, I think, very good to hear, that you may go up and down in your next lifetimes, your future lifetimes, but eventually you will become enlightened, or at least a student of a Buddha. So there are three precepts. There are the precepts of hinayana, or the foundation level. In an earlier chapter, we discussed the Shravaka and the Prajayanas, which are both foundation level. And then there is the Mahayana, which is the second. Here they talk about three levels, but the two foundation levels are lumped into one. This is important to avoid confusion. So you have the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and then the Vajrayana commitments, or in Vajrayana, they're called samayas. So we've got the three precepts, the commitments of the two of them, and the samayas of the Vajrayana, the third one, and then how the individual practitioner will keep these precepts. Now, this is why you have this title, The Disc of the Sun. Having the knowledge of these precepts is like removing the darkness from the room so that you can see things more clearly. Khenpo Karta Rinpoche points this out, that in this particular chapter, Karma Chagme refers to Tsondro Yamso by the title Gelong, and he has not done this in previous chapters. Gelong is a fully ordained monk. So he begins by saying, Gelong Sondro Gyamso, listen carefully. That would get my attention if I had Khenpo Rinpoche or someone else at KTD talk to me that way, because I'm a fully ordained monk. I'm a Gelong. So he asks him to explain the precepts and talk about monastic vows. To go into this in a little more depth, I'm keeping repeating, but adding a few things with each repetition here. You have the hinayana vows, which are called self-liberating vows. And with the hinayana, the vows are concerned primarily with external discipline. And the internal vows are the Mahayana, and they are related to our motivation and how we approach other people. Motivation being concerned with the welfare of other people. With the self-liberating vows, we're more concerned with our own avoiding trouble for us, our own behavior as it will affect us in the future. The motivation in Mahayana is how our actions will affect other people. And then the secret vows are the tantric vows. And he says that only in Tibet are these three types of vows kept. And that is because Tantra is only taught in Tibet. Now I'm going to add a little footnote here. This was written in, I believe, the 1600s. And it turns out that there is a tantric Vajrayana lineage in Japan, of all places, and it's older than the Tantra in Tibet. I believe the title is Shingong. He mentions Gelong Dorje Zinpa. Dorje Zinpa means tantric samayas, and Gelong refers to ordinary samayas that are held by monks and nuns that are fully ordained. So I am trying to, again, explain some of the terminology here. So examples of Dorje Zinpa would be the Dalai Lama and Yalwan Karmapa. Those of you that have done Nyungne will remember there is a prayer, a confession prayer that begins Lama Dorje Zinpa, and then you confess. So the Nyungne is Tantra, and this is why you have heard this term before. For lay practitioners, there is Genyan Dorje Zinpa, and this is lay practitioner vows. And these would, Rinpoche said, would include highly respected lamas like Sakya Tizan, who is married, he's not a monk, and Dujim Dorje, who again is not a monk, was not a monk. To get into this in more detail, Karma Chagme's explanation of the precepts is based on the Havajra Tantra. And this is accepted by all four lineages in Tibetan Buddhism. He talks about some other sources for these vows, and I'm not going to go into that too much. Sometimes you can get too much information. If you really like a lot of information, study this chapter in depth. Now, there is an order in taking these vows, that first you take the hinayana vows of self-liberation. Then you take the inner vows of Mahayana, and then you take the secret vows of Tantra. And it is pointed out that when the Buddha gave the Havajra teachings, he specified that this is the proper order for receiving these vows. He goes into then the different lineages and how they approach these. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Nyingma before I go into the Kagyus, but the Nyingma have 9 different yanas or 9 different vehicles. And when you receive a vow, you automatically receive all 3 types of vows: individual liberation, Mahayana, and then Vajrayana. So to skip some things here, then the Kagyu tradition says there must be no violation to the tantric vows, and that breaking one doesn't break any of the other vows. That if you break either of the Mahayana vows or the hinayana vows, that doesn't break your tantric vows. Sometimes it was taught that if you broke one, you broke them all. There was an analogy here that I liked that made all the sense in the world. The most powerful vow is the tantric vows, and that's like the sun. And if you break that, it's like the sun now is no longer shining, but you still have the moon shining, and that's the Mahayana vows. And if you break that, well, you still have the stars, and that's the hinayana vows. So that analogy seems to make a lot of sense in terms of understanding all of this. And as I said, if you break, in the Kagyu tradition, if you break a hinayana vow, that doesn't break your tantric vows. If you break a Mahayana vow, it doesn't break your tantric vows. Then Karma Chagme and Rinpoche go into pure and impure Dharma and Buddhism and lineages. And he said that when Buddhism came to Tibet, as well as when it was in India, that there would be teachers that were charlatans, that were teaching so that they could accumulate gold. At first, these false teachers or charlatans caused problems, but eventually people began to see them as they were, and the confusion was eliminated. I can't help but feel that Rinpoche was giving us kind of a warning for the 21st century, because there are charlatans that are and impure teachings that are given in the present time, and it's very, very difficult to distinguish what is pure and what is impure, and falling into the hands of the wrong people and being under the influence of the wrong ideas. The internet is a source of endless teachings, many of which have no, shall we say, no basis or no lineage. And it's really important to be careful about who you are following, what book you are using, or books that you are using. And we are so very fortunate that we are students of the Karmapa, and that having our connection with the Karmapa and KTD, it's very clear which teachers are recommended for us to follow. Now, again, I'm going to skip over some of the things that the other lineages are talked about here. So then continuing here, the Kagyupa tradition is that you do not take the 3 vows simultaneously, as was mentioned earlier in the Havajra Tantra, that you take refuge, then later you take the Bodhisattva vows, and then you take the tantric samayas, that they are progressive, and that it's mentioned their potency and effectiveness is progressive. In other words, the Mahayana is a more powerful path than the hinayana, and tantrayana is a more powerful practice than the Mahayana. Then he talks about behavior from a person that has taken all 3 levels of vows, that sometimes a person will break a lower level vow, and he brings up Talopa. And Talopa, again, was a practitioner of Tantra. He was Naropa's main teacher, and it was Mahamudra that was the main lineage that he was passing on. And he would do things like kill fish and eat them. And of course, this brought up a lot of, let's say, a lot of criticism by other people, that you've taken bodhisattva vows. How can you kill fish and eat them? You're killing sentient beings. And I believe he was kicked out of at least one monastery for doing this. At one point, after eating a number of small fish, he took the skeletons and put them in a river or a lake, and they came to life and swam away. But what he was doing was actually liberating their consciousness and sending them to a pure realm. So the point is that what he was doing appeared to be violating his lower vows, but because of his level of attainment, he was not actually causing harm to the beings, the fish that he was killing. And Rinpoche also cautions that just because someone on his level can do this doesn't mean that we can do this. For us, it would be a more appropriate way to violate the vows would be It's in the fall, it's deer hunting, and a deer hunter stops. I live out in the country. Those of you that live in the city, this isn't going to happen, but a deer hunter stops because he sees me outside. Have you seen deer lately? This morning? And of course, I've seen them all over the place. Well, where are they? And I point in the direction where I didn't see any. Well, that is just fine. It violates the commitment to tell the truth, but it is a virtuous breaking of this commitment to tell the truth. I'm protecting life. Rinpoche says that it's very important that these are degenerate times, and even under at the time of Karma Chagme, when he was giving these teachings, that was considered a degenerate time. I think it's very obvious that the time we live in now is degenerate. A dark age, I can't tell you all the factors that are involved in determining whether an age is an age of darkness or an age of light, but one is declining resources, increasing diseases that are difficult or incurable, and of course, warfare. Those are three things, and we're seeing a lot of all three in that area. Oh, and people wanting to steal your possessions through deception. I just got a letter this morning from the Social Security, and it was scam alert, that there is a lot of phone calls out there being made to try to get your Social Security number. Well, I don't have to say anything more. Scam alert. So to continue here, if your commitments are violated, don't get discouraged. Rinpoche says, if we can keep the other commitments, they're still an excellent source of merit and benefit. I am going to skip ahead here. Rinpoche says, or Karma Chagme says, that it's really important to take refuge, because if you don't take refuge, there is absolutely no chance of being able to escape cyclic existence. And that the Kagyu lineage holders do see whether you are able to keep the vows or not, and that they will give you vows knowing that they are planting seeds, and this will eventually lead to the person receiving the vows liberation. Again, to put this another way, they have confidence that you have Buddha nature, Buddha potential, and that regardless of what you have done in the past or what you might be doing in the future, that taking these vows will be beneficial. So even if there are violations of these vows, you still have this imprint, this seed that will blossom eventually. He talks about this flower that blooms in India, and that it retains its beauty even after it has died and dried up. The name of this, it's a Tibetan name, but the name of this flower is Sampaka, Tsampaka. Here is a quote to kind of sum up this point here. No matter how old, ugly, or bad a disciple may be, hundreds of ordinary beings still cannot compare. End of quote. And then there is this story about the monk that renounced his vows and was a farmer, and then another monk saw what he was doing and made him bury his clothes, and so on and so forth. I won't tell the whole story, but later on, then this comes up, and it seems to be related to that story, that even if the world comes to an end, and that there is this, quote, wretched old pieces of cloth used in monastic robes, that was the description, they will not remain on earth. The gods and other beings will take these as sacred objects to the god realms. So the point is to realize how important these teachings are, these vows are, how important Buddhism is, and how it will lead us to where we want to go. And we want to have respect for all practitioners. Some, of course, are going to be better practitioners than others. Some are going to be more enthusiastic. Some are going to be more confused. But to respect all practitioners, they are interested in Buddhism and they're practicing Buddhism. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche described Karma Chagme this way, that he was a highly realized person, a scholar, and had this unbiased attitude of respect towards all Buddhist practitioners. When he entered a shrine room, he would pick up a piece of dust on the floor and do prostrations and so forth, and treat that as a sacred piece of dust. And felt that he was receiving blessings from the dust, from the cushions in the shrine room, and from the practitioners. To continue from that, as Buddhists, we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Sangha has many different definitions. Here he is using the very widest definition of Sangha, and this is anyone who has taken the refuge vows, which is a pretty wide group of people. That frequently the Sangha is considered the noble Sangha, which are the bodhisattvas that have experienced emptiness. Sometimes the Sangha is a little broader, and it is the noble Sangha plus the monastic Sangha. And there are other definitions of Sangha, but here Sangha is everyone who has taken refuge. And so, since we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, we need to have respect for every member of the Sangha. There are two benefits from this attitude. One is it will help us perfect our moral principles. It will help us conduct ourselves better with other members of the Sangha. It will help us accumulate merit. And of course, it will be greatly beneficial to the other members of the Sangha. And I'm going to add, especially those that might feel left out or where they feel that they are not as good as other members of the Sangha. To continue now, Rinpoche says that we have this beautiful, precious human life, and we really must progress, that our aim should be to reach Buddhahood. And I'm going to add, rather than hang out. So it's good to keep motivated, to keep practicing, to keep contemplating, and so forth. And to avoid just feeling happy and, resting in the temporary happiness that you're feeling. Today, I was talking to one of my guests about happiness. And the question is, well, there are a lot of different versions of happiness. And I said, well, what the Karmapa says is what's most important is contentment, where the happiness is within, that you're not looking outside of yourself for happiness, that you're content with where you are, what your experience is. And it doesn't mean that you are no longer trying to improve your material life or your experience and so forth, but it's not that you are driven to have external happiness to cover up internal discord, internal suffering, and so forth, that you feel good. I said that a sign of contentment is when you find yourself smiling and there's no reason to smile. Maybe you're stuck in traffic and for some reason or another, you're smiling and this is not a problem. We need to observe the moral precepts, regardless of how perfect our view may be, which reminds me of a quote by Gampopa, which is, well, my view is as vast as the sky, my attention to, and this is a paraphrase, my attention to conduct is as fine as grains of sampa, which is a very finely ground barley flour. So we need to pay attention to the details of our lives, our conduct, realize that we are still subject to karma. And well, there is this vast view of absolute bodhicitta, of emptiness, and so forth. We need to pay attention to the details of our life and engage in moral conduct. To finish this up, there was a story about this lama, this monk who was in retreat, and his robes kept catching on a thorn bush. And the monk eventually got very mad at that thorn bush and cut it down in anger. And as a result of his angry actions or actions motivated by anger, that in his next life he went to a very bad place and experienced extreme suffering for an extremely long amount of time. So we have to be careful of what we do and our motivation for it. We have to avoid wrong view, and that we have to pay attention to the details of our lives and our vows.